So here's a question to kick things off. Could South Africa's place in BRICS actually be more of an economic tightrope walk than a solid step forward? Are we maybe in this high-stakes global game where our interests, well, they might be getting pushed aside? Welcome to the Deep Dive.
Hi there. Yeah, today we're really focusing in on South Africa and its membership in the BRICS group. Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa.
Right.
And our main goal really is to try and figure out if South Africa is genuinely getting ahead through this alliance, or if maybe, just maybe, we're being used strategically by the much bigger players in the group.
And this whole deep dive, it was kind of sparked by some really interesting points made on the Rebuild South Africa podcast recently. We want to take that analysis a bit further. Okay, so thinking back to 2010 when South Africa joined BRICS, there was a lot of optimism then, wasn't there?
Oh, absolutely. A huge amount. The initial idea, the promise, it was all about this big shift, a rebalancing of global power more towards the global south. People expected, stronger partnerships, more cooperation, and importantly, more investment, more economic chances.
And a big piece of that puzzle was the new development bank, right?
Yeah.
Access to that. The idea of getting funding for major infrastructure projects, building better trade links with these huge economies, it sounded really good on paper.
It certainly did. That was the appeal. The hope was that joining would open doors, bring in needed cash, get the economy growing. But when you actually look at the numbers, the economic data, it gets a bit more complicated.
How so?
Well, South Africa's actual contribution to the total BRICS GDP is quite small in comparison, something like 2.2%.
Only 2.2%. Wow. That definitely makes you think. And if you dig into the details, like our trade relationship with China, for instance, that looks pretty unbalanced too.
Yeah, that's a really key point. The trade figures show a big mismatch. South Africa sends out mostly raw materials, iron ore, platinum, that sort of thing.
The basics.
Exactly. But what we import is mostly finished goods, electronics, manufactured items. And this leads to a massive trade deficit. We're talking over $180 billion.
$180 billion, that's huge.
It is. And the really worrying thing isn't just the number, it's what we're trading. We're basically shipping out raw potential and buying back finished value.
Which means the jobs, the skilled work
Yeah.
that's happening somewhere else.
Precisely. It locks us into this cycle. It hinders diversifying our economy long term. And it feels a bit like history repeating itself, doesn't it?
It really does. That pattern. It sounds uncomfortably familiar, almost like the old colonial days where we were just suppliers of raw stuff to the big industrial powers.
That's a really important comparison to make. The worry is that even though South Africa is politically independent, we might be sliding back into a similar economic role within BRICS, just being a source of materials, not a place for high value making and new ideas.
Okay, and what about those loans from the new development bank? Getting money for infrastructure sounds great, obviously, but are there hidden risks, downsides we should be looking at?
That's a really good question. It brings up the whole issue of the strings attached to these loans. Sure, they provide cash we might need, but you've got to look very closely at the terms.
Like what kind of terms?
Well, things like the potential for debt traps, and what the long-term impact of paying back all that interest means for South Africa's overall economic health. Are the conditions fair? Do they really help us in the long run?
So let's shift gears slightly. Thinking about why South Africa is in BRICS. Is it really about being an equal partner? Or is something else going on? Could it be more about our location?
That's the million rand question, isn't it? Given our smaller economy compared to, say, China or India, is our main value to BRICS actually our strategic position? Being a sort of gateway to the rest of Africa with its, 1.4 billion people.
So maybe our inclusion is partly a bit of a PR move for BRICS.
Yeah.
Giving them a footprint on the continent, but without us having much real say.
Well, there are signs that South Africa's influence within the group might be limited. Take the new development bank. Again, that's the BRICS-owned development bank, right? Meant to fund projects in member countries.
Yeah.
Despite being a founder member, there's evidence suggesting South Africa doesn't get much input on the really big decisions. And key leadership roles in the bank, they haven't often gone to South Africans.
So we helped start it, but we don't get to steer it much.
It seems that way sometimes. And who holds those top jobs really matters because they influence where the money goes and under what conditions.
And being in BRICS seems to put us in some awkward diplomatic spots too, doesn't it? We sometimes seem caught in the middle on the world stage because of who we're allied with.
Exactly. South Africa finds itself under pressure more and more. Pressure to, pick sides in these big geopolitical standoffs, like between the US and China or the whole Russia-NATO situation, it puts us in a really tricky, kind of vulnerable position.
The Russia-Ukraine conflict really threw that into sharp relief, didn't it?
Yeah.
South Africa tried to stay neutral.
And got flack from all sides.
Yeah. It just showed how hard it is to be a smaller fish in a pond with such big sharks, trying not to get pulled into their fights.
It was a perfect example, really. It showed how vulnerable you can be in an alliance like this, where members have very different, sometimes conflicting interests, like being stuck in a superpower tug of war. Staying neutral is incredibly difficult then.
Okay, let's tackle this idea of economic equality head on. BRICS often talks about that, but when you look closely, who really seems to be getting the most out of this deal?
That's a critical way to look at it. The official line is all about mutual benefits, shared growth. But what's actually happening on the ground seems, well, a bit different. It looks like other BRICS countries are pretty good at using the alliance to push their own specific national goals.
Right. Can you give us some examples? How are the others playing the game?
Sure. Take Russia, for instance. Being in BRICS might give them ways to get around some of the Western economic sanctions.
Right.
China, well, they clearly benefit from better access to African markets, partly through their ties with South Africa. India's been busy expanding its pharma and IT deals in this SADC region, using its BRICS connections.
And Brazil?
Brazil uses the platform to boost its diplomatic links with other countries in the global south. So you see, for countries facing restrictions elsewhere, BRICS can open up other doors for trade or finance with member nations.
So while they're getting these concrete advantages,
Yeah.
market access, ways around sanctions, new contracts, what's South Africa getting in return primarily?
Well, the analysis suggests a lot of what South Africa gets is more symbolic. Getting to make speeches at big summits, being part of the group photos, maybe some diplomatic points scored here and there.
But not necessarily tangible economic wins that filter down.
Fewer of those, it seems. Fewer clear benefits that really change things for the average South African on the street.
Which brings us back again to the new development bank loans.
Yeah.
Even with that big figure, what was it, our $200 billion approved? Are we actually seeing the results?
Yeah.
You mentioned the idea of economic opportunity earlier, access to the bank being key. But are there still downsides we need to weigh?
That's exactly the point we need to keep examining. Yes, huge loans have gone to state companies like Eskom and Transnet, but how much of that money is really leading to better services for people, or creating real jobs, or driving overall economic progress? That's still very much up for debate and needs careful watching.
Okay, so if the current setup isn't ideal for South Africa, what could we actually do? How could we get more leverage within BRICS? Move from being maybe a pawn to more of a player?
Well, there are definitely things South Africa could try. One approach could be working much more closely with the African Union, trying to build a kind of unified African voice within BRICS. That would give all African members, potentially, more collective clout.
Makes sense. Strengthen numbers, basically. What else? Any other strategies?
We could get much more proactive about the kind of trade deals we make, really push for agreements that help build up our own manufacturing, add value here, instead of just shipping out raw stuff.
So stop just exporting rocks and start exporting, I don't know, finished products.
Exactly. And beyond that, South Africa could really push harder for more leadership roles within BRICS itself, in the bank and other committees, get more agency, more say in how things are run.
So it's about shifting mindset from just taking aid or loans to actively using BRICS as a stage to negotiate better, fairer deals that actually help us develop long-term.
Precisely that. Using the BRICS connection to demand trade deals that support real sustainable growth here, not just keep us stuck in that old pattern of dependence on raw resources. That would be a huge step.
And thinking even bigger picture, are there more radical ideas, more fundamental changes South Africa could explore?
Well, if you want to think more transformatively, you could look at things like rethinking the state's role in key industries, maybe even nationalization in strategic sectors, or setting up a proper sovereign wealth fund to manage our mineral wealth better.
Sovereign wealth fund, okay.
And using BRICS not just for South Africa, but as a platform to push for broader African economic independence, really trying to break away from dependency on the traditional global powers.
Right. So as we kind of wrap up this deep dive, what's the main takeaway message you think people should leave with?
Look, the point here isn't to be just anti-BRICS for the sake of it, not at all. It's really about arguing for what's best for South Africa.
Hmm.
It's about making sure South Africa is seen and acts as a serious player on the world stage, not just, a junior partner tagging along.
So it really comes down to being critical, asking the tough questions, pushing for better deals, and making sure our leaders are actually fighting for South Africa's interests and our ability to shape our own future.
Exactly right. It's about having that critical mindset, always weighing up the pros and cons of these international relationships, and actively working to secure South Africa's long-term prosperity and influence in the world.
So maybe the final thought to leave you with is this. What would a future look like where South Africa genuinely directs its own story, builds its economy truly as an equal partner with other nations? That's definitely something worth thinking about long after we finish talking today.